First of all, thank you so much for being here tonight, and always the housekeeping first. We'll have our speaker do a presentation, and if you would please, when you come on, mute yourself because background noise does get in the way of the presentation. And if you have a question, please use the chat room, or as we get to the end of the presentation, there'll be a Q&A, and you can wave your hand or do the emoji hand, and we'll call on you. Presentation is about 30-40 minutes, and then the rest of the hour is for questions. And I'm super excited to have Roxane Cohen Silver with us tonight. Roxane is professor of the Department of Psychology Science, the Department of Medicine, and the Program in Public Health, and Associate Director of the Advanced Program for Faculty and Graduate Student Equity, Diversity and Inclusion in the Office of Inclusion Excellence at the University of California, Irvine, where she has been actively involved in research, teaching, and administration since 1989. An international expert in the field of stress and coping, Roxane has spent over 4 decades studying acute and long-term psychologist and physical reactions to stressful life experiences, including personal traumas such as loss, physical disability, and childhood sexual victimization, as well as larger collective events such as terror attacks, infectious disease outbreaks, and natural disasters across the world. So I would just like to welcome you, Roxane, and I thought I'd give a 1 minute on how I found you. So it's a pretty cool story. Was working with 𝗖𝗨, found him through a paper he wrote for the US government, and he was helping me put this summit together. And he said, wait a minute, you have the renowned Roxane Cohen Silver right, around the corner. And so he contacted Roxane, and she said she would be our guest tonight, but we had to go to Israel to go to 10 minutes away, UCI, to find Roxane. So thank you so much. Calling you Roxane, I tend to be informal, but Dr. Silver, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much. Yes, it was quite an unusual invitation to be approached by someone in Israel asking me to give a talk in Newport Beach, and I actually responded immediately and said, this is really sort of hysterical because I drive by that church quite often. So I wanted to thank St. James Episcopal Church and Reverend Voorhees for the invitation to speak this evening. And as I start tonight's talk, I would like to acknowledge the stressors we have all faced. We have all suffered losses, both real and symbolic, both directly and indirectly. Many undoubtedly know people who have been affected by COVID-19 or who have been sick themselves. Thankfully, there may actually be light at the end of this very long, dark tunnel, as the news about vaccines is very good. Although we are likely to still be in for a difficult spring, I am optimistic for a better summer and fall. As was just spoken, I am a professor at the University of California, Irvine, likely down the street for many on this Zoom. And I have been studying how individuals and communities cope with stressful life events for the past 40 years. And in many ways, the past year, the year 2020 and the first few months of 2021, the culmination of all I have studied over the course of my career. I study what are called collective traumas, community disasters that have several important characteristics. They are random. They are unpredictable, certainly unpredictable in terms of the specific timing and the specific place. They are usually uncontrollable, and they are often a shared experience among many individuals. So as I said, I've been studying this topic and these disasters across the world for many decades, and then enter 2020. Certainly something that none of us could have predicted, and certainly none of us would have wanted to spend our 2020 in the way that we did. During the months surrounding 2020 and during the onslaught of a series of disasters, my colleagues and I published a paper that actually just came out a few weeks ago in early 2021 that was entitled Coping with Cascading Collective Traumas in the United States. I decided to write this paper the morning that, or actually the afternoon after I learned of George Floyd's untimely death. And it was at a time that we had been experiencing many months of the pandemic and economic consequences. I began this paper in May, and over the next few months, there were a series of natural disasters in the United States, the worst hurricane season on record. There were terrible fires, as we all know, in Southern California. While they weren't as bad here in Southern California, they were terrible in Northern California, Wisconsin, Oregon. There were unusual tornadoes in the Midwest. And all of these continued to occur. And by the time the paper came out, we were able to start as follows. The year 2020 has been marked by unprecedented cascading traumas, including the COVID-19 pandemic, an economic recession, race-driven social unrest, and weather-related disasters. Mental health consequences of direct and media-based exposure to compounding stressors may be profound. Now, I want to start tonight's presentation to talk specifically about COVID-19, because I do feel that all of the events that followed were very much influenced by the fact that our country and indeed our world had been struggling to make sense of and to tackle COVID-19, the illness from the novel coronavirus. And COVID-19, I believe, feels very different because it is very different in many ways from the kinds of traumas that I've been studying since graduate school. One way in which COVID-19 is quite unusual is that it is an invisible threat. And this became very prominent when we learned that transmission could occur between asymptomatic individuals. So now everybody around is a potential threat. We didn't, and we still don't know who is infected. It's also an ambiguous threat. Back a year ago, just about a year ago, I was asked to give a talk about what I expected to happen over the next few months. And I remember saying, and this is back in March, we don't know how bad this will get. And this is a slow-moving disaster that seems to be altering our sense of time. And I remember very clearly saying back in March of 2020 that we had a very uncertain future. We did not know how long this would last. But I must admit, even looking at my notes that I wrote back in March of 2020, I never dreamed that 1 year later, I would still be saying, we still don't know how long this will last. We still really don't know how bad this will get. And it is still a slow-moving disaster. Moreover, this unusual experience is a global threat. No community is safe. And one of the things that has been really striking to me as I look at maps of the impact across the world is to see that no place in the world has been protected. Even in the smallest islands in the Pacific, there have been cases of COVID-19. So in many, many ways, it is unique, But there are some really unusual features to COVID-19 that I think have made it so difficult to cope with. And that is that because of asymptomatic transmission and because of the fact that anybody could be carrying this disease, we have been told to social distance, to keep 6 feet apart. But our need to social distance conflicts with our natural desire to connect with our friends and family during stressful times. As I said, I've been studying how people cope with stressful events for decades. And one of the things that we know about one of the most important ways in which we cope is to seek and provide social support to friends and loved ones. And yet, COVID-19 has the ways in which we can protect ourselves and others directly conflicts with that natural desire and beneficial consequences to connect with our friends and family during stressful times. Moreover, our typical sources of distraction as we cope with stressful events, such as professional or personal sports, or going to the gym, or going to restaurants and bars, movies, travel, have all been severely restricted. And as things are opening up in certain parts of the country, and as we were just talking before the Zoom began, as it is opening up in our community, it is still the case that many people are not able or don't feel comfortable engaging in the kinds of typical stress release activities that they engaged in prior to the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. Moreover, COVID-19 is so unique because the disruption in our lifestyle has occurred in all aspects of our life, in our social lives, in our work lives, and in our worship. So under this unusual case and under these unusual circumstances, many people have been home and or had time on their hands in which many people dealt with the uncertainty and the ambiguity about COVID-19 by engaging with media. And I want to take some time in particular to talk about the media. It's been something that I have been studying for several years, in particular, the role of the media after mass violence events, school shootings, terrorist attacks, but also during infectious disease outbreaks like the Ebola public health crisis that occurred in the United States in 2014, and in particular in the context of COVID. What we know is that during periods of high ambiguity and uncertainty, people seek trusted information via the media. People seek out risk assessment. They use the media to determine whether or not they are at risk or certain activities are risky. People seek out the media to get recommendations for how they can protect themselves and others in response to COVID. And the media can provide critical guidance. And I would argue, in fact, that it has over the year provided some critical guidance. But I would maintain that the media is a double-edged sword because rumors and misinformation appear on social media quite regularly. People can click and send unverified information, stories, videos, movies very quickly on social media. They can tweet it, they can post it on Facebook, they can post it on Instagram, and there is nobody vetting that information for accuracy. And as I will demonstrate in a few minutes, but what we saw in some prior studies is that the perceptions of risk and anxiety rise when information is ineffectively communicated. And the work of my colleagues and I over the last many years has very clearly demonstrated to us that overexposure to media, particularly about bad news all the time, can amplify distress and can amplify the feelings that people have of being hypervigilant, on edge all the time. And we and others have found that this on edge, this stress that people feel in the acute period of a crisis have downstream mental and physical health effects. And I'm happy to talk more about this at the end of my formal presentation. In addition, media exposure can create a feedback loop of distress and greater exposure to media over time. When people are stressed and they're anxious and their situation is uncertain, they seek out more media. And that increased media, repetitive messaging of bad news all the time, in fact, drives more media exposure. And we get into a feedback loop that can be very difficult to extricate oneself from. In fact, many journalists have contacted me over the last year and asked, can I explain what they labeled doom scrolling, getting caught in a rabbit hole of bad news followed by bad news followed by bad news, where people lose a sense of time and they get caught up in this cycle of constantly engaging with bad news. My colleagues and I decided to study this process and the events that have occurred since the beginning of 2020 with a study that I'll just take a few minutes to show, and I'll show you briefly some data that we have collected to address the kinds of points that I have made thus far. The pandemic, as we may remember, was declared between March 11th and 13th by the World Health Organization, and then the US declared an emergency back about a little bit over a year ago. And my colleagues and I began a study March 18th, 2020, that we followed individuals, and I'll just describe this study very quickly. We took a nationally representative sample of people across the United States, and we studied about a third of them in the first 10 days of the pandemic, when we were all being first learning about the pandemic in the United States between March 18th and 28th. At that time, there were 190 COVID deaths in the United States. 10 days later, we began a second snapshot of another 2,200 individuals between March 29th and April 7th. By that time, about 3,500 COVID-related deaths had occurred in the United States. And by cohort 3, the last 10 days of this 30-day period, shockingly, there were over 16,000 COVID-related deaths. And we can remember that this was escalating so rapidly, and we were so unprepared, I think, as a nation, as a community. And I don't know how many of you have looked at the really helpful and very, very effective maps that have been created from the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. But this is what the map looked like as we began our study in mid-March 2020. 10 days later, a mere 10 days later, the map looked very different. And again, 10 days later, there were over almost 1.5 million cases of COVID-19. You may also remember that this was a time when grocery stores were being, raided. I'm not sure exactly what to call this, but this is the Trader Joe's in Irvine. My colleague went on a Saturday, the first Saturday after COVID, after the pandemic was declared, and she sent me these pictures back. You may also remember the headlines, stocks crashing, the economic downfall. All of this was happening during the time of our early data collection. And the first paper from our project came out a few months ago called The Unfolding COVID-19 Pandemic, a study of a representative sample of people across the United States, in which we sought to understand what led to the kinds of distress that we can probably all recall now, but we were trying to study it in real time as the pandemic worsened over time. And this graph shows the increased rates of acute stress that people were reporting. This is only 10 days later, and we kept seeing an escalation of reports in these representative samples of individuals over those 30 days, significant increase in acute stress as the number of deaths and illnesses increased in the United States, and an increase in depressive symptomatology as those numbers of deaths increased over time. And as we had expected, the more people were engaged with COVID-19 related media in those days, in that early first 30 days after the pandemic was declared, we saw increased acute stress. So the more people were engaged with the media, the more likely they were to be reporting stress. In addition, we understood at that very early stage that people were getting very mixed messages in the media about what they should be doing, what are the causes. This is around the time that we switched from thinking that masks were not necessary to thinking that masks were a good idea. We learned that symptomatic transmission was also possible, in addition to symptomatic transmission, to have asymptomatic transmission. And the more people were receiving conflicting information from the news media, again, the increased amount of stress that they were reporting. So from our early research, we concluded that overexposure to news media can amplify distress in the short term, and we are going to be studying, but expect that those individuals who were feeling that heightened stress in those early days and continued to engage with media over time are likely to be exhibiting mental and physical health effects over time. It is also the case that our research suggests very strongly that conflicting political agendas and contradictory messages in the news media have been especially stressful. So we have concluded a number of recommendations about media in particular. First, we strongly believe that the media should be conveying information without sensationalization or disturbing images. I've noticed for some reason that almost every picture of the vaccine shows a needle going into somebody's arm. There are many people who are needle phobic. Seeing those pictures over and over again, I believe, is unwarranted and stressful. And for anybody who I have had the opportunity to say this to, I continue to say that the media should be conveying information without sensationalization or disturbing images. In addition, I feel quite content with this recommendation that the public should limit repetitious exposure to media stories, all bad news, all the time. People should be selecting authoritative outlets and monitor the amount of exposure, particularly on social media. The public should be wary of unverified reports on social media, and healthcare providers should encourage tempered media consumption. So that's one piece of the story. The second piece of the story that I would like to cover is that it's important to acknowledge that this has been a trauma and that people need to survive this trauma. And I believe people will survive the trauma. And I'd like to just share with you why I have come to that conclusion. And that's based on the continuation of our study into the fall. Our second wave of data was collected on over 5,500 people at a time during the fall when now we have over 200,000 deaths to COVID in the United States. And so we began to try to understand not only what are the tragedies and adversities that people are experiencing, but we tried also to assess whether or not people were able to find some positive aspects of what has been going on. How are they coping? What mechanisms are people using to survive this terrible year? And I'd like to just take a few minutes to share with you some new data that we have not yet published. We're hoping to publish this soon, in which we asked 5,700 people about how they have come to make sense of this event, how have these series of events, how have they coped with this past year. And I want to just point out to you that people have done this in very impressive ways. Many people, more than almost 70% of our representative sample across the United States, report that they have reflected and readjusted their priorities in life. Almost 60% say that they have recognized new strengths and new skills. Many people, almost 80% of our nationally representative sample, say that they have had increased gratitude. Many have said that they have that they felt a greater sense of community despite the isolation, despite the quarantines. Many people have reflected on how they have had more time for leisure activities. And again, over 60%, almost 70%, say that they have reprioritized important relationships. And then we ask people to write in what they were experiencing. And we ran this through what's called a word cloud, in which the computer creates a visual of the word. The larger the words, the more likely people mentioned it. Note, home, time, family were ways in which people coped with, felt good about the experiences that they've been having. Some have made money, saved money. Notice God is here. Some, sadly not me, were able to engage in more exercise. There are many, many interesting ways in which people have said that they were able to find some benefits in the tragedies of the past year. So I'd like to just make some final comments as I share with you the data as well as my conclusions from the past year of studying this issue. I think it's extremely important that we acknowledge that this uncertainty is very stressful. There is no reason to minimize that acknowledgement. It is stressful. And in fact, I have maintained for the last year, and I continue to believe, that anxiety is appropriate under the circumstances. Anxiety is a normal reaction to the new normal that we have been under over the last year. I also think it's important to recognize that we are unlikely to go back to where we were on January 1st, 2020 anytime soon. All the science, all the virologists, all the epidemiologists are telling us that even if life can go back to some semblance of normal, we're not likely to go back to January 1, 2020 anytime soon. And Importantly, based on my decades of research on how people cope with tragedy at the both personal and collective level, is that people are likely to cope with this situation in many different ways, and we should expect variability in response. Our loved ones are not going to cope exactly like we do. Our close friends are not going to cope exactly like we do. And our way of coping may shift within the day or within the week. Anxiety is contagious, but so is compassion. And it's critical that we focus not only on the anxiety, but also on our compassion for our loved ones. It has been the message delivered throughout this pandemic that if we work together, we can save lives. And I think while not minimizing the distress that we may feel now in any way, my research and the research of many others studying how people cope with disasters suggests that people are quite resilient. I do believe that we will get through this eventually, and we will recognize strengths and coping skills that we never realized that we had. I'd like to acknowledge the funding that I've received from the National Science Foundation and my colleagues, in particular, Allison Holman and Dana Garfin, and several of my graduate students and postdoctoral scholars who've been working with me over the course of this past year. And I'd like to now open it up for questions. And I think I can stop the share so that I can see people's faces. And I have not been monitoring the chat, so I'm happy to answer any questions that I don't know if you want to read them, Reverend Boyce.
Yes, I'll take them. Here's one. Do you have the teenage group in any of your groups? What about young people?
So unfortunately, we began with our sample includes people from 18, adults from 18. I think the oldest in our sample is about 98. So we have a range of individuals across the life course, but we do not have children. I believe the next speaker, next in your series is going to be talking about children.
Right.
It's very difficult to study children, particularly during the pandemic, but there has been some research. I will say very clearly our data suggests that the pandemic and the associated stressors have been more difficult for young people and for older adults. That was a surprise to me. Our expectation had been that older adults who were at greater risk of illness and death to COVID would be struggling emotionally. We had expected older adults would struggle more emotionally, and that is not the case. Across both of our waves of data collection, it is clear that young people have really struggled.
Yeah.
I believe, and based on some of the data, we're still exploring this, but we believe that it may be that younger people are more concerned about their futures. They have a longer future to be concerned about. Also, young people many of them have had restrictions on their schooling, both in high school as well as college. People have not been able to graduate as they expected. People have had many symbolic losses. Weddings have been canceled. All of these activities, I think, have made it more difficult for young people to cope. And I also will see over time, as again, the vaccines roll out, we'll hope to see the rebound from young people as they can go back to school, as they can regain some of their social activities. But it's been very, very difficult for young people. Again, that's not to minimize the feelings that older adults have also felt, but it is clear to us in the data, not just our own study, but there have been 3 or 4 other studies nationwide that have suggested that younger individuals, that is young adults, have had a more difficult time coping.
Right. The next question is, you mentioned that healthcare providers could be participating in pushing the messaging of limiting media intake as a coping mechanism. Why don't you think that healthcare providers have been doing this?
Oh, I think that my colleagues and I have given quite a number of talks, and there have been many articles written about this. And I think many healthcare providers are making this recommendation. That was not the obvious recommendation early on in the pandemic, because the media was basically our only source of information.
Right.
I think that we have identified the opportunities that healthcare providers can give to encourage their patients, their clients, to limit the amount of media. And I'm gratified to have seen many more consistent messaging about this over the last 6 months, but it wasn't the case early on in the pandemic, for sure.
Right. What is your practical guidance on reading the news? Not more than 2 hours per day, not more than 1 hour a day? Do you have like kind of an average? What do you?
Well, I'm gonna look back at my graph that let me just glance at it. I don't know if I can make a clear recommendation for everybody, but I personally try to monitor the amount of time, and I try to engage with the media a little bit in the morning, maybe take a break in midday, and some after dinner. I think many people discourage individuals from spending a lot of time as they're lying in bed reading on a tablet or their phone bad news all the time. But I think if I look at the graph, certainly somewhere around 1-2 hours is very different from people who are spending 10-12 hours throughout the day, either listening to radio, checking their phone all the time for notifications, checking social media throughout the day, watching television for several hours. The extremes are what we're most concerned about, but we have found across many of our studies that people are engaging in about, on average, 4 hours a day of media. And I think that people just don't realize it. If they actually started monitoring their time, they would recognize that they're probably spending more time than they wished they might as well.
I would say also, Dr. Silver, that was one of my pastoral issues. In about 6 months on, I would ask people if they were highly anxious or, calling me. I would say, how much news are you watching? And I found that they were watching it all day long because there was nothing else to do. I mean, it was just, or they would have it on while they were working.
Right.
And then I felt like that, well, I would suggest, well, maybe, turn on some music that you like instead of what, but it was kind of especially during the election, right?
Yes.
It was a thriller. So
I didn't mention, of course, note that, our article was written and in press prior to the strain of the election and the aftermath of the election. And
yeah.
We haven't even talked about that as an additional stressor beyond the others that I've mentioned already. Of course, there was an impeachment. There was concern about the validity of the election. There were all sorts of additional stressors that I really haven't mentioned. But what I can say is that most people multimedia exposed. So it's not just that they're watching television. While they're watching television, they may be checking their email. While they're watching television, they may be on a tablet checking social media. They may have a radio playing in the background. All of these things combined are what we're talking about overexposure, and particularly when the news is all bad all the time, which is what was the case for most of 2020. Until we saw the rollout of the vaccine, we saw very little good news. And even the vaccine rollout messaging has been mixed with, well, it may not work really for everybody. I mean, there's still a tinge of bad news even in the good news. And
Right.
I think that is really, it's certainly being exposed to that all the time is really psychologically not very helpful. I will say that I practice what I preach. I engage in no social media. I don't watch television. I don't play videos. When I read the news, if I read it, and I usually read it online, I don't click on the videos. I avoid the videos. I avoid the graphic images. I avoid any images that I can. And that's very conscious. It certainly has been helpful to me as I study these kinds of disasters across the world. It's certainly helpful to me as I study the mass violence events that I've been focused on for about 20 years. But we saw it, we've been seeing it across all of the topics that I've studied.
Thank you. There's a term, Megan's asking, Meg Cooper, I remember from 9/11, called survivor's guilt, like almost a guilt of getting through the tragedy unscathed. Do you see the same with COVID-19?
Excellent question. We have not yet collected our next wave of data. I am expecting to ask about that, but let me tell you a really interesting question that a journalist contacted me last week about. Fascinating question, of which there really is no data on this, but I'm going to collect some data on this, which is, what about people whose loved ones get sick or unfortunately die after the vaccine has already been rolled out and they just didn't get access to it yet? I mean, that's a tragedy of, a sort of unspeakable tragedy if people just could have gotten that vaccine, but they couldn't get it in time and then they got sick and they died. I mean, there are all sorts of unusual cases. I'm certain that there will be some degree of, for some people, again, not for everybody, and we'll try to explore what are the predictors of these kinds of feelings, but I do strongly suspect that some people will feel a sense of survivor guilt. I think I'm expecting to see most people in my sample in our next wave of data collection, which we expect to do this spring. I'm expecting most people will know somebody who got sick from COVID. Yeah. We don't know, of course, how many people in our study will know somebody, but we're well over 500,000, what are we, over 500,000 deaths right now? We're, I mean, it's just, in the United States, it's just unspeakable loss. And I suspect that the people who have lost more loved ones or more friends or more family will be dealing with this for a very long time. And I think that, again, people, I don't want to in any way imply that people are doomed. I do strongly expect resilience. I strongly expect optimism. I strongly expect people to come through this, but I don't think that people will come through it unscathed. I think that that's a naive perspective, certainly for people who have lost loved ones, certainly for people who have had many symbolic losses that they've had. And, our young people have lost a year of schooling. Yeah. They have, I don't have children of school age children anymore, but my son is in graduate school and he has really struggled with the inability to do what he went to graduate school to do. Many students are feeling a sense of isolation. And I think, my friends who are homeschooling their children are finding that the schooling that their children are getting online is certainly less than what they had expected. Maybe some people are thriving. I hear my nephews, my 12-year-old nephews, are thriving in Chicago online. But, you know, again, it's just not what people had expected for the past year. And I do look forward to the schools reopening. The messaging that I'm hearing from the faculty at UCI is the strong encouragement to reopen the schools.
Yeah.
And I'm hopeful that that is going to happen. It's certainly happening sporadically throughout the country. And I do hope that by fall, most children will be back in school. But again, these are losses that that we will really be coping with, I think, for a very long time.
I think that at the beginning of this, that in my pastoral world, that people were affected like, oh, a distant friend or someone I know had COVID. And then it got to be, oh, my brother-in-law or my cousin. And then it got to be my, partner or my brother, or, so it shrank. And now the deaths within a more nuclear family are, I mean, like, I think you're right that with 500,000, you're going to start seeing a closer relationship to the loss and the grieving process. And collectively as a nation, I think it is going to hit more home. I have faith people will take the vaccine more because they're going to see a more direct hit in their own family and be affected by it. So
I mean, the limited data that we see, again, it was in the fall, so it's still not exactly, I can't speak to what's going on right now, although I can project a little bit from my own research and from research that I've read of others. But people who have had personal losses have taken the illness more seriously. They're engaging in more social health protective behaviors. We collected a lot of information about people's engaging in self-protective behaviors. And we do see that people who have lost a loved one or knew somebody who got very sick have taken it more seriously than before that was the case. I think we also have to acknowledge that there are different parts of the country that have had far fewer cases because they just have far fewer people.
Right.
And the hospitals were less overwhelmed. We also know that certain parts of the country had more cases and more deaths early in the pandemic before the doctors and the healthcare professionals learned how to cope with treatments. More treatments have come through. The rate of death has fortunately declined, but there are still many, many people who are getting sick now, and many people are still dying. And that really is tragic. And I think that it's important that people not forget that. Even as we open up and even as people feel comfortable stepping out and going to restaurants and going to movie theaters and going back to Disneyland, it's really important that we still recognize that there are people who are getting sick and dying, and that still is happening. The pandemic is not over. And I think that the most we can hope for is that the vaccines continue to roll out and that people continue to take the vaccines, and that we can convince people that they're safe and effective.
Yeah.
It's going to require some strong messaging from health providers, as well as the media, as well as our first responders, as well as our politicians.
Right. Thank you. I'm going to save this one question from Julie for the last. How do we move forward? But this one is interesting, Karen Bori. How does someone cope with acquaintances that don't believe in COVID-19? I mean, the stressor of that, it's also stressful.
It's extremely stressful. In fact, one of the things that we want, I've been particularly interested in this. I took out some pictures that I had of the gatherings that were still happening throughout the spring and in the summer, the beaches that we saw, filled with people. We will see it during spring break in Florida, undoubtedly, in many parts of the country where people are, I have many pictures that I've taken over the the past several months of people completely ignoring the scientific recommendations and advice. It's very frustrating, and it's very difficult to understand how to break through to individuals who, for whatever reason, don't believe that COVID is real. Part of this has to do with some very mixed messaging that happened throughout the first 6, 9, 10 months of the pandemic. There are still places in social media and on the internet that you can find of people who are denying that this is a terrible situation. I have not colleagues, I have acquaintances who I would say are not taking this as seriously as I am. It's very frustrating, and I think that's a wonderful question, and I am trying to understand the psychology of this denial. I'm trying to understand how we can convince people who see the world completely differently from us. But that's a difficult nut to crack. I have a colleague in the psychology department at UCI, Peter Ditto, who has been studying this for many, many years. We haven't talked about politics, and I as a psychologist, I would like to stay away from the political discussion. Maybe that's more for a political scientist to speak about, but we know that there have been different messaging from different political viewpoints, and I think that that has just contributed to the problem. That has not been the case in other countries, and those countries where the messaging has been consistent and has been clearly dictated by science have had fewer problems than we have had. Just as the way it is.
Thank you. I'll take this one, and then we'll close with how could we, heal. Media has been a source. This is from Robert Shekel. Media has been a source of misinformation. Attempts to put disclaimers on social media was an attempt to help report clear misinformation. Some feel this is censorship, but for the general public, are disclaimers helpful to reduce anxiety from viewers?
Well, I think people who are seeking information from, one can find, if you look hard enough, you can find somebody to support any position in the aftermath of COVID. There you can, I had many people who did not believe COVID send me videos of doctors who apparently said, oh, it's not as bad. There have been physicians, people who have had the credentials that have, I think, spread some misinformation. I'm not sure what the motivation really was. I think that it is difficult for people who hear a constant message that says, this isn't as bad, this is just a bad flu, this is going to go away soon. I think people who are hearing that message are not going to be influenced by a warning label on a tweet that is consistent with the message that they want to hear. As a psychologist, I can tell you that people hear what they want to hear. People seek out information that's consistent with what they believe. People process information consistent with what they believe. Social psychology, which is my field, has been telling us this for many decades. And therefore, I'm not positive how much the warning labels have made a difference. I certainly do not endorse censorship at any level, but I really do feel that it's important that the scientific message get out, and that needs to happen in a consistent fashion. I think that we have seen many epidemiologists and many virologists, many public health folks taking the time out of their day to try to spread the science-based messaging. I've never given so many talks or spoken to so many journalists as I have in the past year. Why do I do it? Because I'm hoping that science can drive the messaging. And the more that the scientists speak out, the more likely we are to drown out the misinformation. I'm not sure that I directly answered the question, but I hope that my comments have been helpful on that domain.
No, I think you did. And I think that it's important that people know that all the speakers on our summit graciously accepted the speaking engagement and graciously are letting us record it, is because I think all of you want the truth to get out there and are willing to share and to, share your expertise. So I really appreciate, the fact that you took a church on.
Truth is not actually the word I would use. I would use.
I meant, the facts. Science.
I'm a scientist.
Science. Right.
I'm a behavioral scientist. I study, I respond to data, and I have spent a lot of time collecting data that is very, very expensive to collect good data. I've been very fortunate to have been funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation to collect these data. And I think, it's still hard to know what's truth. Truth is very subjective, but we can tell what science, we can speak to what science is telling us. And I'm using the scientific method to ask the questions, and I'm using the scientific method to cull from my data and make recommendations. And I think that it's important that we try to do that vigorously. And I know that many people in many universities across the country have and across the world have agreed to try to do that.
I have one question for myself before we get to how we heal and move forward, but I see a numbness toward the deaths, the number going up, the 500,000 and the 525. And I'm just wondering what psychological, is that just a defense mechanism or like a self-protection? But it's like, a lot of people aren't seeing or wanting to hear it right now.
Well, I'll just give you a sense. I mean, it is unfathomable. I used to check that Johns Hopkins site multiple times a day early on in the pandemic as I was watching the numbers grow. And as it got to a number that was just absolutely impossible to come to terms with, I stopped looking at the numbers. And I'm somebody who understood what I was doing. There is a psychologist, Paul Slovic, who has argued that we can't really process these big numbers. It is unfathomable. And the only way in which we can process these losses is individuating them. And we saw some very, very effective messaging in many media reports, and I thought that they were wonderful, to say the people who we've lost have been mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers and aunts and uncles, and to show their names and to show their jobs and to show them as real people. But how can we process over 500,000 deaths? We just can't process it. It is overwhelming. And if we could focus on that, we might not get out of bed in the morning. And so it is a coping strategy to recognize that this is just a massive tragedy, one that we certainly couldn't have envisioned a year ago. And that is not to say that we won't get past this. It is just, I think, disingenuous to deny this terrible, terrible tragedy that we've experienced, which is why I started the paper on coping with cascading collective traumas by saying it's almost too much to bear. We will bear it, we will get through it, but it is really a horrendous tragedy, and everybody has a story, and everybody's story is their own story, and no person's losses are worse than others. I think that symbolic losses are just as important. People who have, I think I shared with you, Reverend, that my daughter's wedding was canceled. Yeah. It was last April. It was supposed to be last April 25th. you know, that was really very, very sad. Of course, we got past it. Of course, fortunately, no one in our immediate family died. Many people in our family got COVID, but, you know, yes, we can focus on the ways in which things are, could have been worse, but they also could have been a lot better. And I think that it is just tragic to minimize this. And I think one of the things that has been very frustrating to me throughout this pandemic is that it didn't have to be this bad in the United States. It's just much worse in the US than it's been in other places. And I'm hoping with the vaccine rollout, it's gone better than I think many people feared that it might. And, you know, I think that the numbers are looking good. I don't think we're seeing all bad news all the time right now.
Okay.
But I don't want this focus on the positive future to in any way trivialize and minimize the tremendous loss that many people have felt.
Right. Okay, so how do we heal and move forward and in a healthy way? What do you, to conclude, you know?
I think together. I really think it's community. It's through community. It's through worship, but it's through our friends and our loved ones. I think that they are our source of support. I think that reaching out to individuals who are isolated and have been on their own is extremely important. I very much feel that people who have really struggled should reach out to their loved ones or their community. I think, of course, faith communities are an extremely important source of support during COVID and beyond. I think that through community, we will get past this. I do fear people who have been completely isolated. I do fear for people who've been completely isolated. And I have recommended to journalists and in writing that it's important that we reach out to others who we think might have been isolated and on their own this past year. I have tried to do the same with individuals that I know. And if we focus back on those things that I showed at the very end, people feeling a sense of gratitude, reprioritizing their relationships, all of these things will be ways in which we will get through this.
Well, on behalf of St. James, thank you so much for joining us tonight, Dr. Silver. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. And I did have the last slide, but I cut it off too soon. If anybody wants to email me, it's rsilver, RSILVER @uci.edu. And I'm happy to answer questions or send copies of the slides if anybody wants them, or any of the articles that I've written. I've written quite a number of commentaries this past year, and I'm happy to share them with others.
Thank you. We did have a question about your PowerPoint, so I'll get with you later on that.
Okay.
So thank you so much for joining us tonight. You're fabulous.
I hope everybody has a safe evening, and I hope everybody has a safe and healthy spring and summer and fall.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, thank you, everyone. Next week, we do have, let's see, Dr. Sandy Abzard. I am having trouble pronouncing 𝗰𝘀𝗃𝗃𝗃, and she's a child psychologist. Like Dr. Silver was saying, we will address the children for our last meeting, which I think is extremely important. So if you have parents and kids and whatnot, just please ask them to join us next week at Wednesday at 7. Thanks so much.
Okay.
Take care.